Points 3 and 4 on the agenda are the exchange of views on human rights in Belarus and the presidential situation on August 9th. And we're going to move on to the second item of our agenda. As I said, we've followed with the greatest attention the peaceful demonstrations that have taken place throughout the country that contest the official outcomes of the elections of the 9th of August, where Lukashenko won, but the population is demanding change. During these protests, the authorities used excessive force, which led to the deaths of at least 2 people and wounding very many others. And the human rights organizations have also noted a large number of random arrests of peaceful demonstrators, journalists, and political activists who describe their conditions of detention to be particularly inhuman. And in this context, the demonstrators have asked for an investigation on police brutality, and this request has been supported by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. The leaders of the European Union have condemned with the greatest force the violence that has been exercised against the demonstrators and have expressed their solidarity with the people of Belarus. And they express outrage at these violations. And this, of course, includes access to several information sites which are close to the opposition and certain NGOs. A wave of arrests of journalists and students also has been reported, including the leaders, including Maria Koleskinova, who was arrested today, and we as yet have no news of her. So without further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague Robert Biedron, who's chair of the Delegation for Relations with Belarus. I will then give the floor to 4 Belarusians. Some of them are in Minsk at the EU delegation's premises, and I would like to thank them for having facilitated this exchange of views. I would also like to give the floor to Mr. Astralevicius before we open the floor for these exchanges. Go ahead, Robert, you have the floor.
Dziękuję Pani Przewodnicząca. Zgodnie z Pani sugestią będę mówił więc w moim ojczystym języku.
So in accordance to your suggestion, I will be speaking my mother tongue. And indeed, I'm very pleased to be able to speak my mother tongue, especially since today I'll be talking about solidarity. And the fact that we need to do everything we can to show support to the people of Belarus, who have an exceptional need for such support today. As chair of relations with Belarus, I have to say that what's happening today in Belarus is highly unusual. And if the European Union and international organizations do not respond in an appropriate fashion, then this glimmer of the hope of change may be lost, because over and above the protests against these fake elections, as we know them to be, the society of Belarus is also experiencing major change from the point of view of its very identity, which is a source of pride for people in Belarus. So this is a change which isn't just political, it's a cultural change as well. It's a societal change, and it's an important aspect. And remember that we're dealing with the last dictatorship of Europe. This is the last state that is actually led by a dictator in Europe, Alexander Lukashenko. This is the last country that still applies the death penalty in Europe, as well as many other provisions which undermine human rights. Contrary to all of the human rights delegations which they actually signed and ratified. So what we're dealing with here is a situation which is unprecedented. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our chairman. Thank you, Marie, to give us this opportunity to convene here and show that we are taking the situation very seriously. And Marie, we're happy to be able to rely on you and on this committee and show that we as Parliament feel solidarity. And let me recall that next September 17th, this September 17th, all of the largest groups, EPP, Socialists, Renew, the Greens, and so forth, all of these groups have given the green light to qualify this situation in Belarus as dramatic, as extremely difficult. And this is this has to do with the presidential elections and the future of the country. So if I were to make any suggestions, then first and foremost, I would expect that we should be decisive in our response. It's not just a question of accepting the outcomes of these elections in Belarus, because according to many experts, these have been falsified elections. They do not comply with international standards. Then there's a question of sanctions to be levied against Belarus. And unfortunately, it would seem that as it stands today, these sanctions will be very limited. Maybe about 20 people will be sanctioned, possibly less. And these sanctions won't even touch Mr. Lukashenko, which is at the very least bizarre. And when we introduced sanctions against Belarus a few years ago, at the time the sanctions were levied against 170 people when the situation was much less serious than it is today. And so at the time it was 170 and now we're down to 20. So we need to ensure that these sanctions are proportional. Another point is that our commitment when it comes to cooperation with the Coordination Committee and Madam Svetlana Tsihhanovskaya, who in Belarus is considered to be one of the leaders, one of the winners of the elections. Of course, there's no tangible proof of this victory, but the society in Belarus, people consider her to be the leader of the opposition against Lukashenko. And of course, the European Parliament needs to take the floor, perhaps set up a delegation to be sent to Vilnius and Lithuania, or invite Mrs. Tsihhanovskaya to come to Brussels. And finally, and not least, is the question of finances that are sent to Belarus from the European Union. And oftentimes this money is misused by Lukashenko, who was trying to show how he cooperated with the European Union. But in fact, the situation can no longer continue, and it has to do with the Eastern Partnership. Now, this policy of critical commitment to Belarus cannot continue as it stands. We need to overhaul that policy and discuss it. So I await this discussion with impatience, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Austrevicius est là comme rapporteur permanent à fait. S'il est présent, non?
Well, I don't know if he is present here today, and if he is, then I will give him the floor as our permanent rapporteur. So now let's move on to our exchange. I wanted to give the floor to Ales Bielatsky. You're the president of the Center of Human Rights in Vyazna. You're the president of coordination that has newly been created by opposition. You have the floor for 8 minutes, please. Thank you.
You have the floor.
And we have a speaker.
Actually, during the very last month, Belarus has been going through a major political crisis that is unprecedented. It hasn't happened for the last decades. So the elections were opaque. They were not just. And people didn't put up with the outcome of the results because they were really rigged, audaciously rigged. And immediately, in the aftermath of the elections outcome proclaimed by the Central Election Committee, people took to the streets against the outcome of the elections. The powers to be took a very strong stand against the demonstrators. During the first days, over 1,000 people were injured. More than 7,000 had been detained. 3 people had been killed during the demonstrations, and 2 were killed under undisclosed circumstances. We believe that they had been killed during the protests as well. And what is more, those that had been detained, they were exposed to a lot of torture, unmask, they were beaten up, and they were treated inhumanely, both during the detention by the police and riot police, which we call OMON, and also while they had been in detention. So they used special means, including rubber bullets and sound grenades. They were beaten by batons, and while they were in detention, the detainees were treated by the mustard gas in the cells. For hours they were made to stand on their knees. Some people had been raped. They were deprived of water. They were deprived of sleep. There was no sanitary means. The cells were overcrowded by the fold of 10. So there were no standards that were adhered to. People were kept together with those who had been infected with COVID-19. So there was no separation between the sick and the healthy. So they were tortured, they were made to sing the national anthem. Those who had been injured were not provided any medical assistance. The protests took place in many cities, not just in the capital of the country, Minsk. And so the protests were systemic and massive. However, the suppression was really encompassing all the places because they wanted to suppress the movement. They wanted to intimidate people, to make them scared so that people wouldn't dare to express their views. We believe that there was a crime against humanity, and the investigative committee from those people who had been tortured received over 500 claims because those people, they submitted their complaints to the investigative committee. However, not a single case has been started. Take the prisons. As of today, there are over 200 people who had participated in the massive protests, and now they are in prisons. And that applies also to those who had been detained during the election campaigns. So 49 people have been acknowledged as political prisoners in Belarus by human rights experts. What is more, there are people who are threatened by imprisonment. It includes the presidential hopeful Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and also the members of the coordination committee, Olga Kovalkova, and also, under the threat of imprisonment, Pavel Latushka also had to flee the country. Today, we witnessed new wave of arrests and detentions. Let me also say a couple words about yesterday. Yesterday, in Belarus, there were new demonstrations in Belarus, and the demonstrations have been going on for more than a month. Several hundred thousand people took place in those demonstrations. The demonstration in Minsk was huge. It included over 200,000 people. However, before the demonstration and after it was over, massive arrests took place. The same arrests did take place in other cities and towns in Belarus. People who had participated in the demonstration had been detained, so over 630 people, 633 to be precise, have been detained, and they are awaiting administrative courts. This morning, a member of the Coordination Council, one of an active members of the election campaign, was detained, Maria Kolesnikova, and also 2 people from her headquarters, the headquarters of Viktor Babariko, another presidential hopeful. So Democratic freedoms have been suppressed in Belarus. Lukashenko is pursuing his policy of attack against human rights and political freedoms in Belarus. And he doesn't adhere to either international opinion, international standards, or the obligations that Belarus undertook when signed international treaties and conventions. So the situation is aggravating. Criminal cases emerge on a daily basis because new people have been detained on a daily basis and they end up in prison. We believe that the voice of the European community and that of the European Union in support of the Belarusian people who wish to live in a democratic society, adhere to human rights, to live in a society where there is rule of law. And that is why we urge you to intensify your pressure vis-à-vis the authorities in Belarus, to intensify your possibilities of providing help in different ways to the Belarusian society. We are also urging you to put an end to violence, to release all the prisoners and investigate all the cases of torture. And we also want you to exert pressure on the Belarusian authorities so that they adhere to their international obligations. Also, let's have a look at Russia, our neighbor to the east. Russia has been supporting blindingly the Lukashenko regime. As a result, Lukashenko is intensifying repressions in Belarus. But let's not forget that the authoritarian regimes are supporting each other. So you cannot address the issue in Belarus without intensifying and exerting pressure vis-à-vis the political leadership in Russia. We also believe that if you introduce political sanctions against those who rigged the elections and were also involved in massive tortures, they should be wide-scale. They should be more encompassing. They should really target those who were guilty in these massive crimes. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour
Thank you very much for these explanations that you have provided us. Thank you, Mr. Bieletsky.